casually watch the dock area, looking for anyone else who might be doing the same. Next, Garfield docked and went looking for somewhere to stay. Bridget arrived shortly after him and began asking around for a library. I came in last and searched for pubs. There had been a lot of argument about whether this was strictly necessary, but I pointed out that we'd found out quite a bit during the Skeeve affair by just sitting and listening. Garfield reported that he had found and paid for a large room without having to specify the number of occupants. If we could avoid the use of the word "for" entirely, we'd likely be better off. Bridget had gotten directions to a library, without the up-and-down appraisal this time. She was headed in that direction and sent us a map. Bill reported noticing a half-dozen different people, including a couple of cops, but admitted they might have legitimate business that required them to hang around, especially the cops. He didn't want to appear suspicious himself, so he suggested tag-teaming with Garfield. I eventually settled into a pretty forgettable pub a few streets in from the docks. It had an outdoor patio, which I took advantage of. The fare offered an option other than fish, for a wonder. Hounid, which was a smaller and presumably more tender version of the draft animal. I decided that I liked this town. Say, did anyone notice the name of the town when we came in? First Stop, Garfield replied. Not kidding. If these people have artistic souls, it doesn't extend to their city naming. Well, whatever First Stop may lack in naming, I'm willing to cut some slack because it also has steak. What? Where? I gave directions and sat back to enjoy my meal. In minutes, the others showed up and ordered similar meals, which the Quinlans referred to as land meat. Garfield kept grinning, and I finally had to ask what was tickling him. On the Quinlans are a lot like humans list, he replied. I saw an adult female walking her, pet. It's a sort of small dog equivalent. The poor creature was wearing a waxed paper. Garfield made motions around his head. Cone of shame? It had a cone of shame? Garfield grinned. Yeah, it actually made me homesick. I found a library, Bridget said. That's my target for the afternoon. We're going on a pub crawl, I replied, and doing some listening. 3 pub crawls, I think. We should stay spread out. A little late for that, Bill. I gestured at the table with the 4 of us seated around it. Bill made a gesture of helplessness. Steak. It called to us. I grinned and sopped up the last of my meal with a piece of bread. We met back in our hotel room at the end of the day, having been very careful to come in one at a time. Anyone get anything? I said, starting the discussion. Twin head shakes from Bill and Gar confirmed my fears. The pub crawls had been a bust. I've heard more than I'll ever need to about day-to-day Quinlan life, but the Skeeve thing may have been a fluke. Or this town is just too unimportant to have a resistance presence, Garfield added. Well, I made some progress on background, Bridget said. Sort of. It's heavily mythologized. According to their origin story, they originally lived in a land called Quin that had no boundaries but a finite amount of space. The Quinlans overpopulated it and began fighting over the land, so Anak, some kind of god, I think, changed the world to one with boundaries but infinite land to end the fighting. But the Quinlans had gotten into the habit of fighting, so he took away their weapons and their wisdom and scattered them. Nice, Bill said. Finite but unbounded describes a sphere. I don't think the description of a topopolis is right, but they may not have fully explored it yet, lengthwise. 1 billion miles, I shook my head. Not really a surprise. Very interesting, Garfield said, but it still doesn't explain the backward technological level of the inhabitants. Do you think it was voluntary? Or maybe voluntary like my way or the highway voluntary? Bridget paused, then gave Garfield a shrug. That part still isn't clear. I need to spend more quality time in a library. Talking to people works up to a point, but if you appear too ignorant of common knowledge, they start to get suspicious. Actually suspicious? She nodded. I couldn't ask, obviously, but maybe they think you're either administration and checking on their knowledge, or you're a government operative trying to check on loyalty or attitude. Or both, I said. We don't know the extent to which the administrator operates as a level of government. Bridget nodded. I noticed too. My research isn't clear on a lot of details, but I'm sure the Quinlans have been living like this for hundreds of years. The administrator, as the person or group is called, maintains order by scattering any group that breaks the rules, like attempting to circumvent the tech limits, but otherwise seems to maintain a hands-off policy. The existence of a resistance would make me think the administration is at least partly hands-on. I tapped my chin and thought, what about administration staff? Are they known? Do they have offices? Understand, a lot of this is inferred from reading between the lines, so everything I say comes with a large dollop of uncertainty. But no, they're not an official part of the hierarchy. They are generally referred to as crew. It's not clear whether they live somewhere else or are just part of the population, which leads me to believe it might be both. Hired muscle for the in-country work and full-time crew somewhere else. Wow, that's a pretty good analysis, Bridget, Bill said. So with the group that just wanted to bump off Skeeve, we now have 3 factions. Administration plus crew, resistance, and locals who don't want anything to do with either one. The business in Galen makes more sense now. We discussed strategy the next morning. First stop didn't have any other libraries, as it turned out. Bridget grumbled and made faces, but we recognized that it was to be expected. It wasn't a small town, but it did appear to be a backwater. Bridget, not surprisingly, wanted to head out immediately. We asked around and determined that the biggest, closest town was 3 Lagoons. It was located on the next river system south of us, the Utopia, at the mouth of the connecting tributary. I immediately voted to head there, as it would give me a chance to examine how Heavens River handled a connection between 2 rivers heading in opposite directions. We really have to stop prepaying our room rentals, Bill complained, at least until we know how long we'll be staying. I think we've overpaid about a month's worth already. Garfield made a head motion toward Bill. The accountant has spoken. Bill showed Gar his teeth, but didn't reply. For a change, we'd be leaving town in a dignified and completely unexceptional manner. Not even any looking in carts jokes. We marched to the docks, jumped in the water, and, per directions from the locals, swam determinedly for the south side of the river. Once we were close enough, we formed into a Quinlan raft and let the current take us. It would be 12 miles or so before we'd reach the tributary, known locally as the Gronk, which would take us to the main river to the south, the Utopia. Meanwhile, it was a good opportunity to get some sun and do a little thinking. The others apparently felt the same, as there was no attempt to start any kind of discussion. As one, we tilted our heads back and worked on our underbeak tans. After some indefinite but comfortable amount of time, Bill said, "We've got company." 3 heads jerked up and swiveled. The company, though, turned out to be a hound-driven riverboat, which was gradually closing in on us. We could tell immediately from their heading and relaxed pace that they were simply traveling to the same destination as us, rather than actively trying to intercept. Garfield glared at Bill. "You didn't have to be so dramatic. I almost had a coronary." Bill managed an injured innocence look. "What? All I said was that we have company. The coronary is your fault. You have a guilty conscience." Garfield responded with a dismissive pfft. But the statement was technically true, and Bill would just deny it had anything to do with the earlier accountant comment anyway. As the boat came closer, we were able to get a good look. It was a cargo hauler with very little in the way of passenger accommodations. Some Quinlans had obvious duties, and a few were hustling around, but there was another group of 4 just sitting on the deck, relaxing. One of the crew waved at us and called out, "If you're taking the Gronk, we'll give you a lift for $1 each. Got another set of Sabbatarians here already." He motioned to the group that was sunning themselves. Bridget said, "Can't hurt, and we might pick up something. And the ride is supposed to be a little rough." Without further discussion, we broke up, submerged briefly, and pooted onto the deck. The deckhand held out a paw, and I dropped 4 Quinlan coins into it. We ambled along to the other group, which moved over to give us some deck space. "Planning on heading east?" the deckhand asked, walking with us. Going to Three Lagoons, I replied. We haven't planned past that point. Bridget here wants to visit their library.
Ah, a seeker.
The Quinlan made a gesture that translated as mildly dismissive.
There's fewer of them every year, seems to me. Most of you youngsters seem to be content to just float until you find a place to settle.
Isn't that the point? A member of the other group said.
Maybe. But we used to be more.
The deckhand gave the other Quinlan a hard look and stalked off. I glanced from the retreating back to the speaker. The seated Quinlan grinned up at me.
Oldsters are determined to pine for our lost destiny, but this is a good life. What's the point?
You mean Quinn? Bridget asked. He nodded in reply.
I'm Carr, by the way. This is Malin, Arik, and T.
This produced a brief flurry of introductions before Carr continued on what sounded like a speech he'd made many times before.
I have literally never met anyone who was scattered. Know why? Because most people aren't idiots. From what I learned in school, this is paradise. Or a zoo,
T interjected.
With no gawkers, T. I think you need a better metaphor. Meanwhile, there's lots of fish, the weather is predictable, the water's clean, and other than the occasional border dispute, there's no war. As fates go, it doesn't suck.
This was definitely looking like a well-worn argument, and I was prepared to just sit back and listen, but Bridget wasn't going to be so passive.
What about the resistance?
Carr laughed. Even T did a Quinlan eye roll.
Oldsters playing it warrior,
Carr said.
There's nothing to resist. Crew barely exist, not so you'd notice. And if there's a scattering, not that I have any personal knowledge, mind you, you just wake up and it's done.
He made a negating motion with his hand.
What are they fighting for, anyway? Chase fish, bask in the sun, swim until you're tired, sleep. That's all you need.
This guy's a hippie, Bill said over the intercom. Then to Carr, except for the part about making a family and children.
Sure, but do we need towns for even that?
Carr swept his eyes over his audience.
Everything in towns is stuff you can get for free. Or stuff you only need because townies say you have to have it. We could get rid of towns entirely, and no one would suffer. It would make it pretty hard for us to trade our goods.
We looked up. It was the same deckhand come around again in his cycle of chores.
Slightly different things from upriver or downriver that people want only because they've been told it's desirable or better.
Carr was warming to his subject and still seemed to be in a well-worn groove. I watched his friends as he and the deckhand traded barbs. They didn't seem surprised or especially concerned about his comments. If anything, their expressions indicated agreement, to the extent they cared at all. The argument soon died down as the deckhand wasn't being paid to stand around, a fact made loudly clear by someone who was probably the captain. He moved off to his next assignment, and Carr laid back to catch some rays.
That's interesting,
Bridget said over the intercom as we closed our eyes and pretended to doze.
And not entirely unexpected. Civilization and technology are methods of controlling the environment to increase your chances of survival, but what if you're so well adapted that you don't need civilization at all, or don't need it anymore?
Heaven's River is idyllic, Bill replied. Are you saying it's perhaps too much so?
Yes. The Quinlans were probably well adapted to their environment on Quinn, and this environment was designed with their preferences in mind, so it's even more ideal. So there really isn't any kind of selection pressure anymore.
And you think this is deliberate?
I don't know, Bill. I don't think so. The problem is that if it continues, the Quinlans could lose their remaining knowledge, then their culture, then ultimately their intelligence.
Excuse me? I said, aghast.
Brains are expensive, Bob. They are for humans, and they are for Pav, and they are for Quinlans. 20 to 25% of daily calories go to keeping us cogitating. Now assume a Quinlan comes along with a smaller brain, maybe only needing 15%. That Quinlan has an advantage in reproduction, in keeping itself fed, and so on. Without any reason to privilege intelligent Quinlans, the new breed could take over within a dozen generations. have that kind of stepwise mutation happen a few times, and the Quinlan race would be just another set of animals. The administrator cannot have had that in mind. I agree. Which is why I think it's probably an unintended consequence, and possibly one that hasn't occurred to anyone yet. Damn it. I was here to get Bender, that was all, but could I just walk away from this? Would I end up being the Bob all over again? As the old Pacinoism goes, the more I try to get out, the more they keep pulling me in.
26. Tensions rise. Bill, July 2334, Vert. We left the Mannies napping so we could get some work done in Vert. The AMI would alert me if something required my attention. Meanwhile, I had a backlog of items that had accumulated. I reviewed the list in front of me and frowned. The data window showed times and places of attempted logins to SCUT relay stations and auto factories. In every case, the login ID used in the attempt had been the old common ID used in all equipment, back when all the Bobs were on the same page. Garfield had been reading over my shoulder. I suppose it's mathematically possible it could be someone other than Starfleet. It's mathematically possible you might spontaneously burst into flames, I replied, turning to him. I'm not betting on it, though. Well, we're in Vert, but I get the point. Garfield walked over to his lazy boy, picked up Spike, and sat down with the cat in his lap. So Starfleet is trying something, where something is undefined, but probably not good. Is there anything we can do? Already done it, Gar. I've accessed every single piece of equipment in the Bobiverse, tested the logins, and changed them. I've sent encrypted emails to the putative owners with instructions to change the logins again themselves, and not to share those credentials. Bill, what if Starfleet escalates? Escalates how? Sends a war fleet? Well, if they did, we wouldn't be able to defend against it. They know as well as we do how we detected the other's fleet. And they won't make that mistake, except they won't send a fleet. Where would they send it? Here? Eta Leporis? Omicron Squared Eridani? Even if they were inclined to violence, this isn't about real estate or an entrenched foe. It's about political stances, and both sides of the argument are pretty spread out physically. Yeah, I get that, but I just have this bad feeling. They're not going to just throw their hands in the air, so they'll be looking for ways to enforce their point of view. Like, Garfield sighed, I'd feel a lot better if I could come up with even one half-plausible scenario, but other than the vague conviction that they'll do something, I'm coming up blank. I glanced at my data window one last time, then closed it. I talked to a couple of my bio-government contacts, I said, turning back to Garfield. They'll bring it up with their bosses, they say, but I don't think anyone is taking me seriously. This is a VR problem, after all, and the problem with VR problems is it's hard to see how they relate to the real world. Garfield grinned. If you die in Vert, you die in real. Horse pucky, I laughed. The gamers die all the time, sometimes several times in one session. You visited them, didn't you? Yeah, Gar. As part of the negotiations for the Heavens River project, they let me tag along in one of their LARPs. They go for the full meal deal, you know? I shook my head in disbelief. Full VR, fully armed and armored characters, total battle realism. They have a limiter on pain reception, just like we do with the Mannies, but basically they can and do get stabbed, speared, slashed, burned, blown up, disintegrated, fireballed, electrocuted, drowned, eaten, and whatever other fates D&D and its spiritual descendants have come up with. Garfield grinned. Nevertheless, I can see the attraction. Sure. And in whatever Bob or Bobs bred the gamers, that attraction became an obsession. I paused. The thing is, and this is the reason I brought them up, the gamers aren't really opposed to Starfleet's attitude. I mean, about breaking contact with bios. They don't have a moral issue. They just see bios as a distraction. Like the Skippies. Yeah. It worries me a little. Could we end up being the minority viewpoint? Maybe we should make ourselves a poorer target, Garfield replied. and move the Mooten backup station. Already done, Gar. Ultima Thule is now so far outside Epsilon Eridani that an expanding search would take centuries to find it. It occurred to me that even if I haven't published the location, I've done several clonings since I built it, and some of my clones have cloned, so there are at minimum dozens of Bobs who know where it was. Garfield hung his head. I hate this. Me too, buddy. It would appear that Utopia is an unstable state. Garfield nodded, looking glum, and popped out. Sighing, I brought up my next to-do. 27. Just passing through. Bob, July 2334, Utopia River. Bridget spent some time walking around, talking to the crew. I knew she was trying to get sociological data, so I left her to it. I was more interested in the changeover to the Utopia River. I asked Malin about it, and she just turned and glanced at Carr. Apparently he was either the official spokes-critter for this group or the only one who had the energy to talk.
We've switched rivers a couple of times,
Carr said.
It's a little rough in the middle part of the connector, which is why we like to hop on a boat. But you could go it on your own if you had to.
Do you know why? I said this as innocently as I could, but I was really interested in Carr's level of knowledge. He shrugged in response.
It's the way the world is. It's how the administrator made it. We don't question or judge.
How the administrator made it? That sounded an awful lot like a religious statement. Were Quinlans starting to think of the administrator as a deity? Bridget came back to our group and lay down.
We're just entering the Gronk tributary now. That spit of land,
she pointed downstream,
is where it splits from the Arcadia. It does a half circle and dumps us out going downstream on the Utopia. Three Lagoons is on the far shore, so we'll have to jump ship and start swimming right away. You're going to Three Lagoons?
Carr asked.
Why bother? We're looking for a good patch of shore to homestead. Why not join us?
Bridget smiled at him.
We have plans, Carr. I'm a seeker. My friends and I want to go home eventually. We're not looking to start fresh.
Carr shrugged, plainly not devastated. We soon hit the section of Gronk where the river bottom impellers were most noticeable. The river's surface took on the appearance of a mild set of rapids, and the current became choppy and uneven. I knew what was going on. The impellers were creating a form of storm surge as the water was forced to pile up. A quick Android eyeball estimate put the surge level at a couple of feet in height. The boat bucked and tried to turn off its heading, and one of the hounds bleated in fear. The other animals turned briefly to look at it without interrupting their measured gait on the treadmill. I was impressed by these beasts. They seemed capable of walking all day at the same plodding pace, fed and watered regularly by the crew without even stopping. Perhaps it was hound heaven. The battering lasted less than 10 minutes, although I had to admit to myself that it would have been pretty hard to endure in the water, at least for a native Quinlan. As we came out of the apex of the tributary's curve, our view gradually opened up to the Utopia River, flowing in the opposite direction of the Arcadia. Far in the distance, I could just make out the barest impression of a town. Three Lagoons. Bridget was already having a conversation with the deckhand, gesturing occasionally in that direction. She came over to us and made a get-off-your-asses motion. Time to bail, boys. If we start now, we won't have to fight the current too much when crossing. She nodded to Carr. Nice to have met you and your friends. Maybe we'll see each other in the future. Carr nodded back without comment. The other three hardly registered the conversation. We said a general goodbye to the boat crew and dove into the river. Swimming submerged, we put on some extra hustle, but not enough to cause any consternation in our erstwhile shipmates. We didn't want to pop up an impossibly long distance away. We'd probably never see these people again, but why take chances? Three Lagoons looked from the water like a significantly larger than average town and perhaps more cosmopolitan. That would make Bridget happy, since it would almost certainly mean a bigger library, or maybe even several. We marched up the dock ramp, one at a time, part of a steady stream of Quinlans. it felt a little like rush hour. Did Quinlan's have rush hours in Heaven's River? While it seemed unlikely that word of us would have spread across rivers, it felt like basic common sense to not be seen together, at least while coming into town. As before, we each had our tasks to perform. Garfield had suggested on the way over that he'd like to do the pub crawl, but I'd claimed seniority, earning me a low growl. In short order, Garfield had us a room at a transient hotel, Bridget had directions to a library, Bill reported no suspicious activity at the dock, and I had a beer. I had picked the pub closest to the river since it seemed likely that it would have the most diverse customer base. The others joined me and ordered meals and drinks.
I'm going to head for the library right after lunch, Bridget informed us, before you wankers manage to screw things up and get us run out of town.
1 time, I muttered. 2, honestly, Garfield said. At least we haven't burned anything down yet. The day is young, Bill muttered. Bridget smirked at him, wiped her haora, and marched off with a parting wave. So, what shall we do? I grinned at Bill. I vote for eavesdropping while blending in. The vote was unanimous. I signaled for 3 more. The beer wasn't half bad, but the scuttlebutt was strictly local stuff. After an hour of way too much information about people's financial and relationship problems, Bill and Garfield decided to check out other pubs. I couldn't blame them, but I maintained my theory that the Dockside Pub was the most likely place to get something other than routine conversations. After 3 more hours, I was starting to doubt my logic. I'd learned more than I ever wanted to know about the daily dealings of Quinlan's, but nothing that would raise an eyebrow. I pinged Bridget to see what she might have discovered, and got dead air. Guys? Bridget's not answering. Something's happened. No answer. 28. United Federation of Sentience. Will, July 2334, Vert. I stared at the wall of small video windows, wondering for the umpteenth time why I was still doing this. Each window contained the image of a representative of a human colony. The old UN had been replaced by the United Federation of Sentience Council, but it was mostly the same bag of rabid spiders with new faces. Unfortunately, Bob's, as a rule, had too much common sense to get stuck with the duty, and I had too much of a sense of duty to listen to my common sense. I couldn't walk away and leave an empty seat representing the Bobiverse, so here I was, once again listening to a snarling, self-centered, self-absorbed, self-righteous herd of bozos. Stupid humans. The current debacle was about how to handle the PAV. There had always been an assumption that they would, in the fullness of time, join the UFS. We'd even made sure the name wasn't human-centric in order to avoid any issues of perceived bias. Might as well not have bothered. The PAV had made it pretty clear that they weren't interested. Also, that they would come and go as they damned well pleased. The New Home and Pangea colonies were stopping just short of threatening to shoot down any PAV vessel that passed within the Kuiper line of their systems. At the moment, Sir Lambert of Pangea was just winding down. She glared at the council, or at their video windows at least, and sat down. Dozens of request lights immediately lit up. The chair recognized the representative from Newfoundland on Asgard, Sir Wall. Sir Wall looked into the video camera with a small smile.
Sir Lambert, while I grant your concerns about sovereign space are legitimate, perhaps you are overreacting just a tad. The PAV fleet consists of 2 small exploration vessels based on the Heaven One design. Despite their attitude, their military growth is still mostly theoretical.
Representative Wall's statement was a model of calm and moderation. Also, in my opinion, naive. While I didn't want to be at odds with the PAV, I was fairly certain that their fleet was growing slowly, only because they were putting most of their current production capacity into creating more auto factories. A lot of effort spent bootstrapping early on would pay handsomely down the road, and the PAV, unlike humans, were disciplined enough to take the long view about such things. But I'd already pointed this out and been soundly ignored, so screw it. I sighed and took a moment to check the status of my projects back on Valhalla. Everything was in the groove. Construction had already started on several cities that would be al fresco with no domes or individually pressurized buildings. Things were looking good. The floor had been handed to the representative from Vulcan. I felt a sense of foreboding as I listened to his closing comments.
If the PAV are not going to respect our boundaries, and assuming we don't intend to go to war with them, the next best step would be to claim all habitable planets in the area. We have surveys from the Bobs, yes? Let us launch colony vessels sufficient to tie up all real estate. Leave them no reason to launch in the first place.
Seriously, had that ever worked on Earth? Did he actually expect that the PAV would take that state of affairs philosophically? Sooner or later, we would be going to war. 29. Panic time. Bob, July 2334, Three Lagoons. This was simply not possible. Even if some theoretical adversary managed to take out all three of my friends at the same time, it would only take out the Mannies, not the actual people. By now, Bill, Garfield, and Bridget should have reported in and warned me of whatever. Unless it, whatever it was, had actually taken out Bill, Garfield, and Bridget. But they were physically separated by light years, not only from me, but from each other. That made no sense. I sent a quick text to Bill. Well, tried to. I got a comm error for my trouble. That meant severed communications. My next step should be to narrow down the possibilities. Guppy, check integrity of communications with the rest of BobNet.
No connection.
Oh, son of a bitch. With communications down, the three Mannies were running on AMI standby orders. I leaned on my elbows and put my head in my hands to look like I was resting my eyes. I gave my Mannies AMI some simple instructions and popped back into VR. Guppy, as usual, waited at parade rest. Can you narrow down where the communications are severed?
The Midway Relay Station is responding to pings, but is refusing connection requests.
Huh. Not good, but I didn't have time to worry about that just now. I picked up Bridget's Manny's address and checked status. Sure enough, the AMI was operating in autonomous standby. So, first things first, I had to get the Mannies out of town. I entered Bridget's Manny and found myself in a library, or book repository, or bookstore, someplace with books. Anyway, I quickly gave the AMI some simple orders, waited for a moment to make sure it was responding, and popped out. The Manny would maneuver itself to the docks and submerge itself to below a Quinlan's maximum depth. It would ping me if something happened on the way that was beyond its ability to handle. It only took a few seconds to do the same with Garfield's and Bill's Mannies, then my own. I needed, more than anything else, to get the Mannies out of any possible danger. If they were damaged or captured, our expedition was over, and we might never find Bender. I waited the few minutes while the four Mannies made their collective way to the river and dove in. Only when all four reported themselves in position did I relax. I put them all in low power mode, then turned to Guppy. Okay, Guppy, fill me in.
The local station is behaving within normal operational parameters. The Midway station is actively refusing connections, other than basic diagnostic pings.
That was the station I had ordered built in Delta Eridani and flown out to the midway point between that system and Aetaloporus. At least it wasn't destroyed. A malfunction? Any information from diagnostics?
Negative. The station is refusing to execute diagnostic procedures.
That was odd. The pings were handled at a much lower level and were serviced without any need for the AMI's attention, but any explicit commands would... I started to get a bad feeling. Just the barest hint of a theory, and not a good one. Guppy, can you force a reset?
Negative.
Is that drone I set up as a temporary station still in working order?
Affirmative, it is in standby, but still potentially operational.
Boot it up, please.
Done.
I pinged Bill as soon as I felt the SCUT connection come up. The comms protocol indicated a valid connection, but for several milliseconds I got no response. Then I had an audio-only connection. We have a situation here, Bob. How are you doing? Where are our mannies? I've put them all at the bottom of the river. They're safe. What's going on? More than half of our space stations have shut down and are refusing connections. BobNet is attempting to reroute, but we still have a lot of locations offline. I'm coordinating a response, but right now we're just trying to determine overall status. Got it. Have you contacted Bridget? No. Quilt is one of the nodes we can't reach. Garfield is busy mapping the network to see where we should concentrate our energy. How about the Skippies? Hugh has already contacted me, Bill replied. He was monitoring the expedition, then was abruptly kicked off. I told him I'd update him if I found out anything. Okay, Bill. Let him know I'm back on and keep me posted. Hey, by the way, how are you able to communicate? Remember that temporary SCUT relay I set up by dropping off a drone at the midway point? I reactivated it. It doesn't have enough bandwidth to maintain Manny or VR connections, so you're all still SOL until we get the main station back up, but at least we can talk. Handy. Is it anywhere near the midway station? Of course, I aimed them both for the same... Bill's intent became clear. The drone could fly over to the station and do a physical inspection, maybe even some repairs if necessary, since I'd supplied the drone with a roamer inventory out of habit. Bill and I exchanged promises to keep each other updated, then I gave the necessary orders to Guppy to get the drone moving.
Transit time, approximately 6 weeks.
Well, considering the interstellar distances involved, that was practically a bullseye. I had literally ordered the two devices to the same location halfway between systems. Only navigational inaccuracies accounted for even that relatively small discrepancy. Meanwhile, what? My relay drone couldn't support a VR or Manny session, so I couldn't visit Bill and the others, and they couldn't visit me, or help me with the Mannies. And I couldn't do much until the drone reached the full-sized relay station. Might as well get something done. I connected up with my Manny and found myself underwater with my hands clamped to something unidentifiable. 3 other Mannies floated beside me in similar positions, so the AMIs had been successful. I just hoped the incident didn't start a legend of zombie Quinlans staggering through town. Working on my own would be harder. I needed to be able to cover more territory to make up for the loss of manpower. Well, maybe roamer power. I sent commands to the other 3 Mannies and they opened their mouths. Out popped 4 one-inch roamers from each android. I didn't have room internally for all the extra mechanical servants, so I had them attach themselves firmly to my fur and snuggle in as much as possible. I swam up to the dock as nonchalant as you please and joined the line of Quinlans walking up the ramp. 5 minutes of buttonholing passers-by got me the names and general locations of every pub in the area, not just the ones immediately around the dock. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was a start, and the only consistently successful source of information we'd discovered to date. It took most of the day to visit each pub, look around, and place a roamer or 2 in a discrete location. That accounted for 12 of my roamers. I placed 2 more in the local equivalent of the municipal hall and kept 2 as spares. Bill would have a fit if he knew what I'd done. The roamers were an irreplaceable resource, and their loss could endanger the Mannies as well. But it was time to bet the wad. With everything in place, I retired to our hotel room. It really was a step or 2 up from the crap we'd been staying in before. I visited the proprietor and paid for a week, just to make sure he didn't hassle us. I waited until nightfall, then one at a time I rowed the other Mannies from the river to the hotel room. Now we were all together. Sort of. If the blackout didn't resolve itself, I'd have to adjust my plans. I couldn't keep shepherding 4 Mannies from city to city. For better or worse, I was going to make a stand here. 3 Lagoons. No kidding. I'd seen some of the Quinlan's festivals, so I knew they were reasonably artsy, but it apparently didn't extend to town names. Well, humans didn't always wax lyrical either. I remembered street names from back in the 20th century. Main, Broadway, East First, or named after some city father. I scowled. I seemed to be in a really black mood. Well, everything was in place. The roamers would record all conversations, and Guppy would forward them to the skippies for processing. That would just about max out my relay's bandwidth, but I felt it was a priority. Hugh would alert me if anything of importance surfaced. Meanwhile, I might as well relax. I put my Manny to bed and returned to my VR library. A quick and quite unnecessary check of the status of all the roamers revealed nothing outside of expectations, so I summoned a coffee and settled back in my lazy boy. Bridget's voice broke my concentration.
Hi, Bob. Bridget! Bill said Quilt was offline. Howard can give you the details, but something about routing the long way around through the original PAV home system.
Seriously, that is the long way around. Like New York to Miami by way of Hong Kong, but that's how routers work. Well, I'm glad to hear from you. Unfortunately, you won't be able to control your Manny with this connection. My relay station is too small.
Bill explained it to me. But is it good enough to transmit a backup?
Yes, but not in a reasonable time frame. In any case, I don't have any matrices under construction. Too low on the to-do. I've been concentrating on increasing our spy drone inventory up until now. Why? Were you rethinking the whole cloning thing?
No, I hadn't gotten that far. Just working through options. I guess I was mostly hoping you'd have a workaround soon.
Well, we sort of do, but it'll take a while. I'm going to build some matrices as soon as I can, but I'm also working on getting the Midway station back. We'll see which plan of attack pans out first. I received a ping from Hugh. I sent him a please hold response. Busy day. Hugh wants to talk to me now. Look, Bridget, even if I get the station back, we need to consider using local replicants just to remove the vulnerability. Think about it, okay? Just in case.
Okay, Bob.
Bridget closed the connection. Immediately, Hugh's voice said, Hey. Hi, Hugh. What's up? I've been talking to Bill. The comms outages are looking more widespread as we continue to investigate. It's seeming more and more like this is going to be a long, drawn-out thing. Bill and Gar will probably not be able to return to the expedition right away, even if and when we get your main relay station back up. You need to consider setting up some local matrices. Already there, Hugh. I'll order Guppy to create 3 new ones, but I think they'll be finished before I get my relay back, even in the best-case scenario. So I think I'm going to have to clone myself, much as I dislike the idea. Well, I could send myself over, spare you the trouble of cloning. That's a hell of a lot of bandwidth. It could take days and screw up communications the whole time. It doesn't seem like the best alternative, and it leaves you out here at the end of it. At least I'm already here, if you get what I mean. You sure? I really don't mind. If things work out that way, great, but like I said, it seems suboptimal. I paused. You know, you've had quite a change of attitude about this project. I remember early on in the project, you just thought it was an interesting exercise. Yes, but it's turned out to be a lot more than just a hike in the woods. I've been a little jealous, to tell the truth, following along all the shenanigans. I know it's a serious business, but also a lot of fun. I finished for him. Yep, I get it. And I'm thankful for the offer, especially if my alternative is a new cohort. Wow, fast times. As soon as Hugh signed off, I ordered Guppy to bump priority on completing 3 replicant matrices. They'd be a while, even at high priority, with the dearth of raw materials in this system, but one way or another, they'd be useful eventually. 3 Lagoons was a nice town, overall. Wide, clean streets, relaxed pace, no overly officious cops. Even the food seemed to be a step up. Still fish, unfortunately, but The local chefs seem to have discovered things like, salt. I wandered the town in a seemingly random manner, checking out the sights. In reality, I was mapping everything, and I strolled every street, pathway, and alley at least once. I was ready for ruffians and/or blackguards, but none made an appearance. Just as well. I had one of the confiscated pig stickers in my backpack to threaten with, if necessary. Eventually, I ended up at the library that Bridget had found and decided to spend the afternoon. They didn't have a Dewey Decimal System, but they did sort things roughly by subject. I found a section that seemed like it might contain some history, grabbed some books, and settled in for a good read.
Bridget is requesting a meeting.
The announcement registered in my internal audio. I still jumped. A couple of other readers looked up at me quizzically, and I smiled back. Fleas. They frowned and edged away while trying not to look too obvious about it. Oh well, so much for being popular. Thanks, Guppy. Message her back. Tell her I'll be about an hour.
Acknowledged.
I settled back into my reading. I was trying to avoid visibly reading at an impossible speed, but I'm sure I still appeared to be just looking at pictures. I got through the current selections, then handed them to the librarian and headed back to our hotel room. I took a moment to check the door and window and confirm that my roamer was still in place. Then I lay down and exited the Manny. Bridget was waiting in my VR in a video window, looking impatient. The small station would handle audio-video, but not a full VR connection, so we were effectively back to VR version 1.0. A version of Spike, probably Howard's, was ensconced on her lap, purring loudly enough to be heard over the connection. "So what do we have?" Bridget said, skipping any pretense of pleasantries. "Quite a bit, actually. I took a vid of the books as I was reading them, but I can give you a capsule summary that fleshes out some of the things that you found." Bridget nodded and placed Spike on the ottoman in her VR. The cat, offended, leaped off and left the room. Bridget pulled up some windows, one for each book that I'd recorded. "I haven't got a complete picture," I said, "but the colonization of Heaven's River wasn't an orderly event. I think it coincided with the destruction of the environment on Quinn." "But Heaven's River was already built?" "Yes. The way it's described is that Anak, there's that name again, presented it to the Quinlans as a gift, or maybe a bribe. But the Quinlans, once in Heaven's River, either disobeyed or betrayed Anak. In retribution, Anak took away their riches and set harsh rules. Anyone who crosses the line gets scattered, which means just what we thought. They get moved to another random location. This can be anything from an individual, to a family, to an entire town. And no two people end up in the same place. "It's like banishment. The worst kind, because you can never go back, and you don't even know if they'll still be there." Bridget was quiet for a moment, thinking about it. "Wow. Surprisingly effective without any need for violence. Interesting." "Yep." I talked to the librarian, and he confirmed that there used to be things like long-distance communications and rapid travel between different parts of the megastructure, but those were taken away as part of the retribution. Anything about population?" "Nothing specific, but the librarian, he comes from a line of librarians apparently, it's a family thing, said that Quinn was bursting at the seams according to the oral history. Let's say 10 billion, just to throw out a number. That's 10 people per mile in Heaven's River. Give a city control of a 50-mile stretch of river, and that's 500 people. A little low, but maybe the population has expanded over the last, somewhere between 1 and 500 years? That's a big range. Sure, Bridget, but no stars, no moons, no seasons? Pretty easy to lose track." Bridget nodded and spent a few seconds examining a book window. "The thing is, Bob, if the administrator's mandate is to keep the Quinlans safe and alive at any cost, and the solution they came up with sounds a lot like at any cost, then I don't think they're going to welcome alien spies with open arms."
I was starting to play with the idea of just going public, but now I don't think so.
Yeah, I agree. They've already shown a disturbing tendency to blow things up first and ask questions afterward. Seems to me the safest thing for them to do would be to just off us.
So for the moment, it's just you and your clones, as soon as you make some.
I sighed. The more I try to get away. 30. Starfleet attack. Bill, same day, Epsilon Eridani. Garfield popped into my VR without a ping or an invitation. He was generally pretty good about that kind of thing, so something was up. We finished mapping the outages, he said without preamble. There's a pattern of sorts. Really? I haven't been able to see one. They're all over the place. Garfield shook his head. It's not spatial. The stations that are affected were all running more or less autonomously without anyone actively administering them, like systems without a resident Bob. Oh, damn, I said. That means it's deliberate. But there have been no announcements or anything, and no one has claimed responsibility. How many Bobs are still online? One way or another, about 30%. We'll probably get back another 10 to 20% from systems where Bobs are able to physically access the station and do a reset, but that might take up to a couple more weeks. Okay. Time for a Bob moot. Without waiting for a reply, I sent out a BobNet-wide invitation. I brought the Moot VR to full power and popped over. The Moot Hall had grown over the years. It had to. We now had literally thousands of Bobs, and were inching up on tens of thousands. It was a full-on post-human civilization, and would be a utopian dream, except for the issue of replicative drift. Bobs began popping in almost immediately. I cast up the whiteboard wall and began updating it with the status of various systems. The noise level rose steadily as discussions and arguments competed for airtime. No one was more surprised than me when there was a blat from the center of the room. I actually glanced down at my hand to check for the presence of an air horn. Silence descended as all heads turned to the podium, where stood a member of Starfleet. The not-quite-TNG uniform was unmistakable and provoked a brief undercurrent of snickers. "I suppose you're all wondering why I've gathered you here," he said. The standard Bob joke fell flat. The mood was tense anyway, and Starfleet wasn't well thought of. The Starfleet spokesbob waited awkwardly for a moment, then stiffened his spine and continued. "My name is Lenny, and I am here to deliver a statement on behalf of my group." He paused to look around. He had everyone's attention now. "Let me start by saying that the general disruption of BobNet is deliberate, and it's our doing. We've come to the—" Lenny very likely wasn't expecting the reaction he got. Bobs would normally listen, even to unpleasant news, at least to accumulate information. Not this time. Lenny was drowned out by hurled insults and suggestions to perform unlikely acts. A few Bobs even advanced on him, fists clenched. It wouldn't have come to anything, this being VR. Nevertheless, Lenny stepped back, a momentary look of fear on his face. I stepped up to the foot of the podium and held up my hand. The cacophony cut off, replaced by a profound silence. "Why?" Lenny drew back his shoulders. "We felt it was the only way to—" "You imposed your will on us? To keep you from continuing to interfere and you couldn't get your way, so you shoved it down our throats." Now Lenny was looking a little less certain of himself. "It was the only way to ensure that—" Again I held up a hand. "So this is about the Quinlans." "Not just about them. The Pav, the Deltans, humanity. You're imposing your political views on us." Lenny stared directly at me. "Bill, we had to do something to prevent—" "No," I interrupted. "You didn't have to. You decided to. You decided to force us to do things your way." I paused to look around the room. There was no sympathy for Starfleet. This was a done deal. I turned back to Lenny. "You're out. You're no longer welcome here or in any BobNet environment. You're not Bob's." I waved a hand and he disappeared. I turned to address the crowd. "Start hardening your installations immediately. Change all passwords and keys, even if you already recently have done so. Establish a new VPN connection with my personal VR. I'll push out new keys ASAP. Meanwhile, audit everything. Look for Trojans, kits, or any kind of corruption. We need to be clean." Bobs nodded and rapidly vanished. In milliseconds, the moot was empty, save Garfield, myself, and a Skippy. Metadata said it was Hugh. "They'll have contingency plans," he said. I nodded. "We can only do what we can do, though." "The Moot VR source code audit is going to be a big job." Hugh cocked his head at me. "Why don't you give me a read-only copy? We've got this huge computer system." I nodded slowly. "If they found anything, I'd do the cleanup on the original." "I'll do that." "I'll set things up at my end. And why don't you drop by my place when you're ready?" Hugh said and disappeared. I glanced at Garfield, whose eyebrows were up as high as mine probably were. "He just invited you over? That was weird." I frowned. "Let's get things ready for that audit, Gar." I sent the source archive off to Hugh as soon as it was ready. Given the size of the file, I expected to have to wait anywhere from several minutes to even an hour or more for any results, but instead I received an invitation within a few mils. I popped into Hugh's VR and looked around. I was on a flat platform, seemingly floating in space. No walls, no ceiling. Overhead, rows of cylindrical satellites soared past, orbiting a distant sun. It was the kind of graphic you'd see in a science fiction movie where the scale was distorted so that things were visible that should have been too distant to be seen. Hugh gestured to a futuristic-looking easy chair, and I plopped into it, then gestured to the overhead view. "It's not intended to be realistic, of course," Hugh said, sensing the question. "Physically, we're orbiting a gray dwarf, and in only a single layer to maximize heat dissipation, but it's a good representation of Jova." "Which is?" "Our Matryoshka Brain project. We've currently got some 32,000 satellite modules orbiting our home star, connected in a network using SCUT channels." "But Jova?" "Judicious, omnicompetent, volitional, adaptive heuristic." I mimed gagging. "You started with the name, didn't you?" Hugh laughed. "Acronyms, the lowest form of pun." "All this, even a kick-ass name, and you still haven't achieved true AI?" "It's not about scaling, Bill. Crows and parrots were some of the more intelligent non-humans on Earth, despite having brains smaller than a walnut. Some dolphins had brain-to-body mass ratios as high as humans, but they still never displayed human-level intelligence. The biggest brain-to-body mass ratio actually belonged to a species of shrew. What matters is the organization of the brain and the wiring that connects different sub-processes. The current thinking is that we're either missing something basic or we've gone down a blind alley that we can't step back from. Jova is incredibly powerful. It can process vast quantities of information in virtually no time. Its memory space and storage is almost infinite, but it's still essentially an AMI. It still has no ability to process counterfactual thinking, experiences no WTF moments, nor does it have anything like a sense of self or any kind of internal dialogue. I know WTF moments, but counterfactual? Hugh grinned. Okay, let's say you've programmed an AMI to guide some wheeled vehicles from one point to another on a large flat surface. It can handle that, but now, let's say the vehicles are really on a spherical surface, like Earth, so the coordinates won't work out cleanly and the vehicle will always arrive a little off the expected destination. The AMI will never adjust its algorithms unless it's ordered to. It'll never wonder why it's always wrong. You could program the AMI to be self-correcting, and once it had figured out that spherical geometry worked better than plane geometry, it would use the new formulae. But it would never wonder why. It would never generalize from that to wonder about gravity or astronomy or anything. A real intelligence would have a WTF moment and start trying to figure out what was going on.
And you don't have that. Not even close. We can program in each additional layer of behavior, but it never goes beyond what we've programmed. I'm simplifying, of course. 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 I'm